Hello and welcome to this presentation about my work on verified code generation for the polyhedral model. This is joint work with Xavier Leroy. This work is all about loops. Loops are omnipresent in numerical computing, and most numerical computing problems can be expressed as some programs with loops. More specifically, loop nests. Loop nests are a subset of programs which are structured as instructions, typically assignments, and these instructions being combined by sequences and counted loops. Moreover, we require that all the loop bounds must be affine in loop variables, and that data access must also be affine in loop variables. So an affine function here is a linear combination of its variables plus an optional constant. Since loops are so important in numerical computing, compilers do a lot of optimizations on them. For instance, one such optimization is loop permutation, which exchanges the order of two loops, and is useful because it sometimes improves memory locality. Or loop tiling, which almost always improves memory locality. But there are many other loop optimizations, such as loop reversal, distribution, fusion, splitting, skewing, permutation, and so on. The polyhedral model is a general framework for optimization of loop nests. It is based on a declarative representation of loop nests as an iteration space, which are the points where to execute the body of the loops, and a schedule which specifies the execution order of the loop, of the contents of the loops. It is a very mathematical representation based on polyhedra represented by linear inequalities, affine functions, and lexicographic order. A loop nest can be expressed as a polyhedron by just looking at every point where the body of the loop is executed. For instance, in this case, these points are a triangle with k less than m less than n. The schedule, which specifies the execution order, is the lexicographical order of the loop indices, here m then k. Most loop transformations I talked about earlier can be expressed as an affine transformation of the iteration domain or as a change in the scheduling function. There are a few data dependencies to respect, but the transformation itself needs just these two parts. For instance, loop interchange is easy to express as a polyhedral transformation. It suffices to change the schedule to iterate first on k, then m, instead of first on m, then k. The polyhedral program is the same, except for this change of schedule. A polyhedral optimizer is generally structured as three parts. The first part is extraction from a traditional language to a polyhedral representation, sometimes guided by annotations by the programmer, or translation from tensor notations. This has been done quite a lot in recent years, such as TensorFlow, tensor comprehensions, etc. On the polyhedral transformation representation, we can do loop optimizations, as I said earlier. The final step is code generation from this optimized polyhedral representation to classical imperative code with counted loops, which can then be fed into the backend of a compiler. After we have done these polyhedral transformations, so the last step is to go back to this imperative language with explicit loops. For that, we need to synthesize a control flow where a loop nest corresponds to a lexicographical order. This is a code synthesis problem and is actually quite difficult. Our contribution is a formally verified code generator, verified in Coq, which takes as input a polyhedral representation and as output produces an imperative program and is completely formally verified to be correct and semantics preserving. The first part in our generator is to eliminate the schedule, replacing it by an implicit one, which is lexicographic on the loop indices, so that the next step is easier. After this step, we generate an abstract syntax tree in an intermediate language with high-level constructs, and I will go into details about this part later. We have a third step which eliminates redundant constraints generated by the previous step to produce more efficient code. The redundant constraints were introduced earlier for simplification of the previous pass. The last pass is loop nest emission, which generates standard imperative code with counted loops. And all in all, we get a generator from a polyhedral representation to imperative code. Let us now see how to generate polyhedral programs, to go from polyhedral programs to syntax trees. First, we will see what is a polyhedral program and what are its semantics. A polyhedral program is simply a multiset of polyhedral instructions, where each polyhedral instruction consists in a base instruction, typically an assignment, a domain, which is a set of points where to execute the instructions. This domain must be a polyhedra. A scheduling function which specifies the iteration order, and a transformation function which gives parameter to the actual instruction from the point in the domain. Together, this gives a polyhedral instruction and a polyhedral program. The semantics of polyhedral programs are given in an environment, E, which attributes values to program parameters. First, we compute the list of each point on instruction, such that the point is in the domain of the instruction, and the value of program parameters in this point corresponds to the environment. Then we sort this list by lexicographical order of the scheduling function, and finally we execute the instructions on these points in this order. The target language for this step is an intermediate language which is imperative but with very high level control, that is, it has tests and loops and polyhedra. The objective of this program, of this language on this path, is to sketch the shape of the resulting program without going into details about how to perform the tests. To that end, it is composed of statements such as sequences, base instructions, but also guards, which are a bit like an if condition, but with a polyhedra, and loops, which are counted loops, but with bounds given implicitly by a polyhedra. These polyhedra are themselves represented as a conjunction of linear inequalities. To give semantics to this intermediate language, we use the following big step semantics. The skip, sequence, and instruction parts are quite classical, and I will not go into detail about them. The most interesting parts are the guard and loop. Guard PS executes the statement S if the environment, that is the current contents of loop indices as a vector, is inside the polyhedron P. Likewise, the loop construct will look at all the x such as the current environment extended with x is a vector belonging to the polyhedron P. Then execute for each of these x the statement in order. We will first see how to generate this code from this language in the case of only one polyhedral instruction. To do that, we first compute the projection of the polyhedron on the first d dimensions. Then we create a loop node corresponding to this projection, and we repeat with an additional dimension. For instance, suppose we want to generate code corresponding to scanning a triangle. In the first step, we project the triangle on the first dimension, giving the polyhedron where m is between 2 and n. This is the outer rectangle in the picture. We generate a loop node corresponding to this, and we recurse on one more dimension. After adding one dimension, we project on these extra dimensions, and we get the whole triangle of where we want to execute the instruction as a result of the projection. If we fix m, we get the vertical bar in the figure. So we generate a loop node with this polyhedron, the triangle, as the argument. Finally, we get into the maximum dimension, and we generate the body of the loop inside the two loop nodes. The general case is generation of syntax trees in the case of several polyhedral instructions. It is more complicated because we might have several instructions which must be executed interleaved as the schedule might give different positions for different nodes in different polyhedra. The algorithm is similar but with two extra steps. First, we compute the projections of each polyhedra on the first d dimensions. Then we separate the projections into a list of disjoint polyhedra. We order these projections while respecting some data dependencies. We create a loop node for each projection, and we repeat with an additional dimension. Let's see how it works on an example. Here we start with three instructions. One is the black dots, one the red triangles, and one the blue squares. After the first step, the projection on the horizontal axis, we already separated our polyhedra into two polyhedra. One where all three instructions are present, and one where only the red triangles are. We then perform a second step, and there are again many projections after separation. For instance, we've got the A polyhedra with blue squares and black points, the B polyhedra with black points, the C polyhedra with black points and red triangles, etc. There are a few dependencies that must be respected as well. In this case, due to the lexicographical order, A needs to be before B, which needs to be before C. We do not have a constraint between D and the others. So in the generated code, we can see that A lies before B, which is itself before C. Finally, as we reached the maximum dimension, we fill the body of the loops with the instructions that must be executed in these points. During our formalization of the algorithm, we found an incompleteness of this algorithm. Indeed, while it is known in the literature that two disjoint polyhedra can always be ordered, this is not true with three or more polyhedra. In this example, the red polyhedron must be ordered before the green one, which must be ordered before the blue one, which itself must be ordered before the red one. We can, however, work around this by splitting the polyhedra further. However, we have not seen in the literature any mention of this incompleteness, and we suspect it has not been noticed before. However, it does not seem to occur in practice, so most polyhedral code generators do not seem to have a problem with this case. Now that we have produced a syntax tree, the last two steps of code generation is to produce counted loops. To that end, we first do a redundant constraint elimination pass, where we simplify the code to remove redundant constraints introduced by the previous pass. To that end, we perform the simplification of a statement inside a context polyhedron, meaning that the specification of this pass is that if we are inside this context polyhedron, then the resulting program is semantically equivalent to the input. We use recursion to simplify inner loops while collecting information from the loop head. This pass removes most constraints that do not involve the loop variable. For instance, in this case, we have removed the m less than n constraint from the inner loop and completely removed the guard. Once this is done, we can generate counted loops, where the target language is a standard imperative language with no high-level operations on polyhedra. And to generate code for a given loop, we look at each constraint in the loop polyhedron. The constraints independent of the loop variable become an if node outside the loop. The constraints on the loop variable are converted to lower and upper bounds. This can fail if there is no lower or upper bound, but this means that the input program did not terminate. In this case, we have simply generated two nested for loops. But if we had not removed redundant constraints earlier, for instance, here the m less than n constraint, we still generate correct code, but it is suboptimal because there are additional if guards like the if m less than n in this case. If we hadn't removed the guard, we would have also an if node inside the innermost loop. Finally, let's talk about the code development. So first, it is available online at this URL. It contains the formalization of all semantics and their transformations. So that is the polyhedral languages as well as the intermediate and dark byte languages, the transformations from one path to the next, with correctness proofs that each of these paths preserves the semantics. For that, we had to write a small library of basic linear algebra, polyhedra, and operations on them. An interesting feature of our development is that it uses no dependent types at all for vectors or matrices. Instead, we use simply lists of integers, which are implicitly padded with zeros to ignore the instead of if it is too short, and we ignore the remaining coefficients if it is too large. We also use the verified polyhedral library for some primitive polyhedral operations. And in total, we have about 8,000 lines of code, which is quite small for the result we proved. Our future work includes further simplification of produced code, like strided loops or let binding inlining. But it also includes formalization and verification of the polyhedral optimizations part, that is the part before code generation, which is the second part in most polyhedral optimizers, and possibly connecting with an existing polyhedral optimizer for experimental validation and comparison with more mature polyhedral optimizers. To conclude, this is the first formally verified code generator for the polyhedral model. It shows that compiler verification is not just for conventional compilers, for conventional languages, but it can also work for code synthesis from high-level specifications, which has, to our knowledge, not been done before. Thank you for your attention.